On the morning of 2 February 1685, King Charles Roman II of England rose from his bed at Whitehall Palace, believing it would be an ordinary winter day. The Thames outside lay cold and grey beneath the fog. The court had quieted after the festivities of Candlemas. Charles, 50, 4 years old, appeared weary but not gravely ill. He dressed, spoke briefly with his attendants, and moved toward the fireplace. Then, without warning, his body betrayed him. He collapsed violently to the floor, convulsing, his limbs jerking uncontrollably, foam forming at his mouth as the King of England lost consciousness before his household. Panic erupted inside the royal apartments. Servants shouted for physicians. Courtiers froze, uncertain whether this was a faint, a seizure, or the death of a monarch whose survival held the fragile political balance of England together. Charles Roman II, the man who had been restored to the throne after civil war, regicide, and republican rule, lay helpless on the floor, shaking, gasping, and unable to speak. Within minutes, the royal doctors arrived. What followed over the next 4 days would become one of the most brutal medical ordeals ever inflicted on a reigning monarch. By the time Charles Roman II finally died on ***, 6 February 1685 ***, his body would be bled, purged, blistered, poisoned, and exhausted in the name of 17th-century medicine. His final days were not peaceful, not dignified, and not merciful. They were prolonged, agonizing, and revealing of an age that understood suffering as treatment and pain as cure. To understand why Charles Roman II's death unfolded with such horror, one must understand the man, the kingdom he ruled, and the political storm waiting to erupt the moment he stopped breathing. Charles Stuart was born in 1630 into a world already tearing itself apart. His father, Charles I, believed fiercely in divine kingship, and that belief cost him his head in 1649 when Parliament executed him for treason against his own people. Young Charles was forced into exile, wandering Europe for years while England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles Roman II returned as a symbol of national exhaustion. England wanted stability, not ideology. Charles provided it. Unlike his father, Charles Roman II learned restraint. He laughed easily, avoided religious fanaticism in public, and understood compromise better than conviction. His reign became known for cultural revival, scientific curiosity, and a relative easing of political terror. Theatres reopened, the Royal Society flourished, London rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666, yet beneath the surface, unresolved tensions festered. Religion remained the most dangerous fault line. England was officially Protestant, but Charles privately leaned toward Catholicism. His brother and heir, James, Duke of York, was openly Catholic. This terrified Parliament, which remembered bloody religious wars and feared absolutist rule aligned with Rome. Several times, Parliament attempted to exclude James from succession. Charles blocked them every time, dissolving Parliament rather than surrender his brother's right to rule. By the early 1680s, Charles governed without Parliament entirely, ruling by royal prerogative. He survived assassination plots, political conspiracies, and public unrest. Yet his health was deteriorating. He suffered from gout, digestive problems, and recurring fatigue. His lifestyle did him no favors. Charles enjoyed wine, mistresses, late nights, and indulgence. Though not obese, he was worn. When Charles collapsed on that February morning, the doctors immediately assumed an apoplexy, what modern medicine would call a stroke or seizure. Their response followed accepted medical doctrine of the time, rooted in humoral theory. Illness was believed to result from imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatment meant removing excess humors aggressively. The first step was bleeding. Surgeons opened a vein in the king's arm and drained blood rapidly. Over the course of the day, Charles would lose an estimated 16 ounces, then more. When he regained consciousness briefly, he was confused, weak, and unable to speak clearly. The doctors did not pause. They believed the urgency justified everything. Next came purging. Charles was forced to swallow violent laxatives designed to empty his bowels. His body, already exhausted, began to cramp and dehydrate. Blistering followed. Hot irons or caustic chemicals were applied to his skin to raise painful blisters, believed to draw disease away from vital organs. His scalp was shaved, and blistering plasters were placed on his head. At no point did the physicians agree among themselves. The royal medical team consisted of more than a dozen men, each trained differently, each determined to demonstrate authority. Disagreement led not to restraint, but escalation. When one treatment failed, another was added. As Charles lay in bed, trembling and sweating, the court watched closely. His mistresses were summoned and dismissed. His wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, remained at his side, weeping quietly. Catherine had endured years of neglect and humiliation due to Charles's numerous affairs, yet in his final days she became his most constant comfort. The political consequences of his illness were immediate. If Charles died, James would become king. Protestant leaders feared a Catholic monarch. Foreign ambassadors watched closely, especially from France and the Dutch Republic. Louis Roman, 14 of France, had long sought influence over England, while William of Orange stood poised across the Channel. Even in agony, Charles remained aware. Witnesses recorded moments of lucidity where he apologized to those around him for being an unconscionable time, dying. The remark, often quoted as charming gallows humor, masks the reality that his death was being actively prolonged by medical intervention. On the second day, more treatments followed. Enemas made of herbal concoctions were administered repeatedly. A paste containing crushed beetles was applied to his skin. He was forced to swallow powdered pearls dissolved in vinegar, believed to strengthen the heart. None of this eased his suffering. His breathing grew labored. His tongue swelled, his body bloated. At times Charles begged for rest. The doctors refused. To stop treatment would be to admit ignorance. Pain was evidence that the medicine was working. The King of England became a patient trapped in the worst logic of his age. Behind the closed doors of Whitehall, ministers whispered about succession. James was summoned quietly. Catholic priests were placed nearby, though kept hidden to avoid public scandal. Charles had never publicly converted to Catholicism, but many suspected he wished to die in that faith. The timing of such a conversion would have explosive consequences. As night fell on the third day, Charles grew weaker. His voice faded. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The room smelled of sweat, chemicals, and fear. Candles flickered against heavy tapestries bearing the symbols of a monarchy that would soon change forever. The man who had survived exile, civil wars' aftermath, plague, fire, and political conspiracy was being undone not by an assassin, but by the medicine meant to save him. And the worst was still to come. By 3 February 1685, it was clear to everyone inside Whitehall Palace that King Charles Roman, too, was dying, even if no one dared say it aloud. The night had been long, filled with groans, whispered prayers, and the constant coming and going of physicians who refused to accept that their treatments were failing. The king's body was no longer simply ill. It was collapsing under the combined weight of disease and cure. Charles awoke briefly in the early hours, drenched in sweat, his sheets soaked, his breathing shallow and irregular. His face had swollen, his lips cracked and dry. The repeated purging had stripped his body of strength. He had been bled again during the night, despite already being dangerously weakened. The theory was simple and merciless. If illness remained, more blood must be removed. By now, more than a dozen medical men crowded the chamber. Some were physicians, others surgeons or apothecaries. Each had his own remedies, his own pride, and his own reputation to protect. None wished to be the man remembered for letting the king die without exhausting every known treatment. In that desperation, restraint vanished. Charles was forced to swallow a mixture of senna and manna to induce further purging. When his stomach rejected it, stronger compounds followed. His bowels cramped violently. Witnesses recorded that he cried out in pain, something rarely heard from a king trained since childhood to suppress weakness. The sounds echoed through the palace corridors. Blistering was renewed. Fresh plasters were applied to his legs and shoulders, burning the skin raw. The logic was that drawing fluids outward would relieve pressure on the brain. In reality, it only added agony to a body already failing. His skin became mottled and inflamed, his pulse weak and erratic. At intervals, Charles drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he was often lucid enough to understand what was happening to him. He apologized repeatedly to those around him, not for political failures, but for the inconvenience of his dying. The remark, recorded by several witnesses, has often been romanticized. In truth, it was a man aware that his suffering was being prolonged, powerless to stop it. Queen Catherine remained near the bed, praying softly in Portuguese, accented English. She had always been an outsider at court, isolated by religion and ignored by her husband's affections, yet in these hours she showed remarkable composure. Charles squeezed her hand when able, offering quiet words of comfort to the woman who would soon be a widow in a hostile land. Outside the chamber, the machinery of power was already shifting. The Duke of York, James, stood ready. Though summoned discreetly, his presence was known. Protestant courtiers watched him with thinly veiled fear. James was Catholic, disciplined and unyielding, the opposite of his brother's easy charm. Many believed his accession would undo everything the Restoration had stabilized. Foreign envoys waited anxiously for news. The French ambassador understood that Louis Roman XIV's influence over England depended heavily on the succession. The Dutch watched even more closely, knowing that James's reign could push England toward alliance with France and against Protestant Europe. Inside the room, none of that mattered to Charles. His world had narrowed to pain, thirst, and exhaustion. His tongue was swollen from dehydration. His lips were rubbed with herbal ointments that did nothing to ease the dryness. At one point, he begged simply for rest. The doctors refused again. On the afternoon of **, 3 February **, a new remedy was proposed. The king was given a concoction containing powdered human skull, prepared from the remains of an executed criminal. This substance, known as king's drops, was believed to cure seizures and apoplexy. It was mixed with alcohol and forced down his throat. Charles gagged but swallowed. No improvement followed. Later that evening, enemas were administered again, this time containing wine, herbs, and oils. The king's abdomen bloated painfully. His breathing grew labored, each inhale a visible struggle. His heart raced, then slowed unpredictably. Still, the physicians debated. Some suggested cooling treatments. Others insisted on further stimulation. None questioned whether their combined assault had surpassed the original illness. To them, stopping meant surrender to death itself, something 17th-century medicine was philosophically unequipped to accept. On **, 4 February **, Charles's condition worsened sharply. He became increasingly delirious, speaking fragments of sentences, sometimes mistaking one courtier for another. Yet even in delirium, he retained moments of startling clarity. During one such moment, he summoned his mistresses, Nell Gwyn and Louise de Querouaille. To Nell Gwyn, his most famous mistress and a woman beloved by the public, Charles offered practical concern. He asked his brother James to ensure she was cared for after his death, famously saying, "Let not poor Nellie starve." The request was not theatrical. It was precise, reflective, and painfully human. To Louise, Duchess of Portsmouth, he expressed similar care, though her position as a Catholic and a French favourite made her far more politically controversial. Even in dying, Charles balanced affection with calculation. As the day progressed, the doctors attempted one final escalation. A caustic substance was applied to the king's scalp to raise additional blisters. The pain was intense. Charles cried out again, then fell into a semi-conscious state from which he rarely emerged. The room fell quieter, not because hope returned, but because certainty arrived. The physicians could no longer pretend recovery was possible. They began to argue not about cures, but about timing. How long could the king last? Whether he might rally briefly, whether the treatments should continue or shift toward comfort. Even now, comfort was a secondary consideration. Late that night, something changed. A Catholic priest was quietly ushered into the palace. His presence was concealed from most of the court. For decades, Charles had navigated England's religious divide with careful ambiguity. Now, facing death, he no longer needed to pretend. In a private moment, shielded by curtains and trusted attendants, Charles received last rites according to the Catholic faith. He confessed, he prayed, he accepted the sacraments. The act was deeply personal, yet politically explosive. Had it become public before his death, it might have triggered unrest. That secrecy alone reveals how dangerous belief remained in England, even after years of supposed tolerance. Afterward, Charles appeared calmer. His breathing slowed. His face softened slightly, as though the greatest struggle was no longer physical. The doctors resumed fewer treatments, though bleeding and purging had already done their damage. As dawn approached, the king lay mostly unconscious, his body swollen, his skin blistered, his strength spent. The man who had restored the monarchy now hovered between life and death, not swiftly crossing, but lingering in a state of drawn-out collapse. The suffering had not ended. It had simply entered its final phase. By the morning of 5 February 1685, King Charles Roman II no longer resembled the lively monarch England had known for 25 years. His body was swollen almost beyond recognition. His face, once animated by wit and easy laughter, was bloated and pale, his eyes sunken, his lips cracked and darkened. He lay propped weakly in his bed at Whitehall Palace, surrounded by silence broken only by laboured breathing and the occasional murmured prayer. The physicians had finally reduced their assaults, not out of mercy, but because there was little left to assault. The king's veins had been drained repeatedly. His digestive system had been emptied again and again until it could respond no further. The blisters raised across his scalp, legs, and torso had ruptured, leaving raw, weeping skin beneath the linens. The stench of illness, medicine, and sweat hung heavy in the chamber despite open windows and burning incense. Charles drifted in and out of consciousness. When he awoke, his speech was faint but coherent. These moments of clarity were brief and precious, and those gathered near the bed leaned in, fearful they might miss his final words. What struck observers most was not fear, but composure. Charles seemed resigned rather than panicked, aware that his body had been pushed past the point of return. His brother James remained close now, no longer hidden. The inevitable could not be delayed further. James, Duke of York, stood at the bedside, watching the man who had protected him for decades slip away. Their relationship had been complicated, marked by affection, disagreement, and political tension, yet in these hours it stripped down to blood and memory. Charles took James's hand and spoke softly, his voice barely carrying. He urged his brother to be kind to those who had served him faithfully. He repeated his concern for Queen Catherine, asking James to treat her with respect and generosity. He mentioned his illegitimate children, several of whom stood in the room, and asked that they not be forgotten. These were not the words of a man clinging to power, but of someone tying loose ends, painfully aware that the world would go on without him. Catherine herself struggled to maintain composure. At one point, overwhelmed by grief, she collapsed weeping beside the bed, apologizing repeatedly for her inability to help him. Charles, barely able to lift his head, comforted her instead. Witnesses recorded that he told her she had been a good wife, a statement loaded with regret and reconciliation. For a marriage that had been distant and often painful, the moment carried quiet tragedy. Outside the chamber, England waited. Messengers moved through the palace carrying updates to ministers and foreign envoys. The news was grim but measured. The king still lived. He might rally. He might not. The uncertainty froze decision, making across the government. Laws could not be enacted. Orders could not be signed. The machinery of state hung suspended, dependent on a failing body. In London, rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed the king had already died. Others insisted he was recovering. Pamphleteers prepared competing narratives. Protestants feared Catholic plots. Catholics prayed for James's peaceful accession. The scars of civil war were still remembered, and no one wanted to test them again. Inside the bedchamber, the doctors watched helplessly. Their earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by quiet defensiveness. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally offering mild remedies, though everyone understood they were now spectators rather than participants. The damage had been done. By midday, Charles's breathing grew increasingly irregular. Long pauses passed between breaths, followed by sudden gasps that lifted his chest sharply. His pulse fluttered weakly beneath the fingers of those checking it. His hands were cold, his feet colder still. The signs were unmistakable. In one of his final lucid moments, Charles made a request that would echo through history. He asked for forgiveness, not from God alone, but from those he had wronged. He expressed regret for his shortcomings as a king, though without theatrical repentance. It was calm, measured, and deeply human. He also made one final joke, as if unwilling to abandon humor entirely. When someone remarked on how long he was taking to die, Charles reportedly smiled faintly and apologized again for being so unconscionable a time. The line has often been quoted as evidence of courage, yet heard in context, it was more tragic than triumphant. This was not a swift passing bravely endured. It was a prolonged dismantling of body and dignity. As evening approached, religious tensions resurfaced quietly. Though Charles had received Catholic last rites, Protestant clergy hovered nearby, uncertain how to present his death to the public. England could not afford a religious crisis at the moment of succession. The official narrative would need careful shaping. James, now effectively king-in-waiting, began to prepare. Documents were drafted. Messengers were positioned. The Privy Council stood ready to proclaim him the moment Charles breathed his last. The transition needed to be immediate to prevent unrest. In the final hours of **5 February**, Charles lost consciousness almost completely. His eyes no longer focused. His breathing became shallow and erratic. Those closest to him understood that dawn might never come. The room grew quieter. Candles burned low. No one spoke unless necessary. Outside, the palace corridors filled with tense stillness. Guards stood motionless. Servants moved softly, as though sound itself might disturb the fragile balance between life and death. Sometime during the night, Charles's breathing slowed further. His chest rose only occasionally now. His heart, overworked and deprived, struggled to maintain rhythm. The man who had survived exile, rebellion, and assassination attempts was finally being defeated, not by enemies, but by the combined weight of illness and the era's faith in suffering as salvation. England waited for a single moment, one final breath. In the early hours of 6 February 1685, as the winter darkness still pressed against the windows of Whitehall Palace, King Charles Roman, II of England, finally crossed the threshold that medicine, prayer, and power had failed to delay. The room was hushed, the air heavy with wax, sweat, and exhaustion. Those gathered closest to the bed could see it before it happened. His breathing had slowed to faint, irregular movements, each one separated by long, frightening pauses. Then quietly, without drama or final proclamation, the king exhaled and did not draw another breath. Charles Roman II was dead at the age of 54. There was no sudden release from agony. no heroic final surge. His death was the natural conclusion of days of systemic collapse, accelerated and magnified by the relentless medical practices of his time. The man who had restored the monarchy after England's darkest political rupture died not with the dignity later portraits suggested, but physically broken, drained, blistered, and exhausted. The moment his death was confirmed, protocol replaced grief. Attendants moved swiftly to secure the body. Curtains were drawn. Physicians stepped back, some visibly shaken, others defensive. Within minutes, messengers were dispatched to alert the Privy Council. Bells were prepared, guards repositioned. The machinery of monarchy, long suspended in anxious waiting, lurched back into motion. By mid-morning, James, Duke of York, was proclaimed King James Roman, II of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The transition was immediate and deliberate. There could be no vacuum, no hesitation. England had learned at enormous cost what uncertainty at the top could unleash. Yet beneath the smoothness of succession lay unease. Charles Roman II's death did not bring closure. It reopened old wounds. Publicly, the king's passing was framed as dignified and calm. Official accounts emphasized his composure, his wit, his reconciliation with God. The brutality of his treatment was softened, even omitted. The physicians were not blamed. Medicine, after all, had done what it was believed to do. To question it too deeply would be to question the intellectual foundations of the age itself. Privately, however, many understood what had occurred. Eyewitnesses spoke of the endless bleeding, the violent purging, the burning blisters, the experimental remedies that left the king weaker with each hour. Even by the standards of 17th-century medicine, the scale of intervention was extreme. Charles had been subjected not to care, but to escalation, driven by fear of failure and the belief that pain equaled progress. Modern historians have debated the original cause of Charles's collapse. Some suggest a stroke. Others propose kidney failure, possibly worsened by chronic gout and dehydration. There are even theories of mercury poisoning, given the treatments commonly used at the time. What remains indisputable is that whatever illness struck him on 2 February did not require the dismantling of his body to the degree it received. His death became a silent indictment of pre-modern medicine, though that indictment would not be fully recognized for centuries. For Queen Catherine, the days following were marked by isolation and grief. As a Catholic widow in a Protestant court, her position was precarious. James Roman II treated her with formal respect, honoring Charles's wishes, but she soon withdrew from public life, eventually returning to Portugal. Her quiet devotion in Charles's final days became one of the few unambiguously human elements in a process otherwise dominated by power and procedure. Charles's mistresses, too, faced uncertain futures. James honored his brother's request to care for Nell Gwyn, granting her a pension that allowed her to live comfortably. Others were less fortunate, their influence evaporating overnight. With Charles's death ended not only a reign, but an entire culture of court life defined by charm, flexibility, and calculated indulgence. James Roman II brought something very different. Where Charles had been adaptable, James was rigid. Where Charles diffused conflict with humor, James confronted it with conviction. Within 3 years, his open Catholicism and authoritarian instincts would provoke widespread opposition. By 1688, James Roman II would be overthrown in the ** glorious revolution **, replaced by William and Mary. In that sense, Charles Roman II's death set England on an irreversible path toward constitutional monarchy and parliamentary supremacy. Had Charles lived longer, history might have bent differently. His political skill had held competing factions in balance. His death removed the last buffer between England and a crisis it had postponed but not resolved. The manner of his death also shaped perceptions of monarchy itself. Charles Roman II did not die as a distant, godlike ruler. He died visibly human, weak, afraid, apologetic. His final days stripped away the illusion of invincibility that had once surrounded kings. The sight of a monarch subjected to the same medical brutality as any common patient quietly undermined the idea that royal blood conferred protection from suffering. In death, Charles was embalmed and prepared for burial with the full dignity denied him in dying. His body lay in state, draped in royal symbols, his physical ordeal concealed beneath velvet and ceremony. The public saw a composed monarch laid to rest, not the blistered, bleeding patient who had endured 4 days of relentless intervention. He was buried in Westminster Abbey without elaborate monument or inscription. Unlike many kings, he left no grand tomb proclaiming his greatness. Perhaps that absence speaks more truthfully than marble ever could. History remembers Charles Roman II as the Merry Monarch, a king of wit, restoration, and cultural revival. That image is not false, but it is incomplete. It ignores the cost at which his life ended, and the system that prolonged his suffering in the name of knowledge and authority. His final days matter because they reveal more than personal tragedy. They expose the limits of power in the face of mortality. They show how deeply belief can override compassion. They remind us that progress often emerges not from triumph but from recognizing failure. Charles Roman, too, survived exile, rebellion, and conspiracy. Yet in the end, he was undone by the very hands meant to save him. That is the truth history has often softened.